Web Marketing That Works, episode 44.
Welcome to the Web Marketing That Works podcast. Come behind the scenes of real-life marketing experiments and listen in as amazing guests confess the truth about what really works. Now, here are your hosts, Adam Franklin and Toby Jenkins.
Hi there, everyone. It's Toby Jenkins from the Web Marketing That Works podcast. This is the show for people who love marketing on the web, and today is no different. You're going to be taken behind the scenes of podcasting with one of the masters of the game, Timbo Reid. He's got a number one ranking in iTunes globally for his Small Business, Big Marketing podcast. It's a cracker, and I really suggest that you check that out. He's going to be sharing the good, the bad, and the ugly, and really getting into what has worked well for his podcast. And I can tell you what, there's a ton that I've learned from him just in our interview. So this show is brought to you, as always, by our new book, Web Marketing That Works, and specifically the bonus templates that go with it. So if you are keen to get your hands on 33 free web marketing templates and marketing templates, then jump on over to bluewiremedia.com.au/book. Let's get on with the show. Okay, so g'day everyone. I'm really stoked to have Tim Reid as our guest on the show today. Adam and I have been watching him for years, and Timbo, you've been kind enough to come along to speak at a couple of our events as well. For those of you who don't know Tim, he's an advertising guy or former advertising guy, and both a non-profit and corporate marketer. You may well know him as the host of Australia's number one marketing podcast, Timbo. Congratulations, Small Business, Big Marketing. And if you haven't checked that out, then I would seriously recommend that you do. Tim, thanks so much for joining us.
Oh, Tobes, thanks for having me, mate. I'm honoured to have been invited into the Blue Wire cave.
Oh, mate, well, I guess the shoe's on the other foot. I mean, we've been watching your podcast and listening to it, watching you do the podcast and listening to it for a long time. So really,
it's always nice to be on the other side of the microphone every now and then.
Yeah.
It's actually a really good strategy. It's a marketing strategy for listeners. I mean, I'm sure your listeners, Tobes, are across many industries, but go out and seek interviews on podcasts. And that goes for a dentist, a plumber, a masseuse. There'll be podcasts out there that have an audience that you want to get in front. So, and podcasters are always looking for content, aren't we, Tobe?
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, looking for guests. Oh, well, there you go. Tip number one.
Tip number one.
40 seconds into this.
There we go. We should have a little dinger. A little
ding.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Timbo, just before we sort of jump into the marketing in a bit more detail, I'm always intrigued. I'd like to know what sort of gets you out of bed each morning.
What gets me out of bed each morning? I actually start my day. I mean, it's a literal answer, but I like to start my day with a bit of fitness. So I actually look forward to getting up and, although it's a painful thought, just racing off to the gym and knowing that, 40 minutes later I'm going to feel pretty good. So that's a literal answer. That's what I do when I get up, and that's what gets me up. But awesome. I just look forward. I'm growing a speaking business at the moment. I was just talking to you before we hit record about the fact that most of my work right now is public speaking, keynote speaking around the world, and I'm just really honoured. The fact that that's growing, it just amazes me, I really look forward to what each day brings in regards to that.
Any exotic locations recently?
Well, this year, all around Australia, lots and lots of times, and I've been to LA, Disneyland, Fiji, Auckland, Queenstown, Dubai, Singapore, Shanghai. I mean, it blows my mind, even to reflect then.
Yeah, that's incredible.
So, yeah. I actually checked in, when it really, really came home to roost, Toby, about 3 or 4 months ago. I spoke at a conference at the Disneyland Convention Centre, and then on the last day, the group were transferred to the Beverly Hills Hilton for a gala ball that night. And as we were approaching, the bus driver said there's going to be a delay because President Obama is checking in at the same time as we are. And he was. And we arrived, and it was just like you can imagine. It was lockdown, and we were allowed in. And
wow.
Here I am with the president checking into a hotel, obviously he wasn't lining up to check in, but all these people were, and it was all happening. And I was like, why am I here? And the only reason I was there is because I was speaking at that conference. And the only reason I was speaking at that conference is because I've committed to creating a podcast on a regular basis, and it's helped build my personal brand, as small as it is.
Wow. That's pretty cool. So how long have you been podcasting?
This is my 5th year.
5th. Okay.
Yeah.
And how many episodes are you up to?
205 I'm up to.
Wow.
Yeah, which now I put a show out of the Small Business Big Marketing show every Tuesday, but there was a time, there have been periods where, particularly when I had a co-host, Luke, and for the first 80 episodes, and that made it harder to put out an episode every week. So we did it whenever we could, just because, nature of bringing two people together and bringing in a guest and just the whole logistics just made it a bit harder. But now that it's just me, it's been consistently every Tuesday.
Yeah, right. And I mean, you were actually, just before we hit record as well, you were sort of talking about just recording it in the car, in the hotel rooms, that sort of thing.
Yeah. Mate, the marketing world, you know this, and your listeners are listening because they want to know this and want to believe it and want to understand it. The marketing world's changed. The ability for us small business owners to get our message out there, to be helpful, to educate our clients, to draw them towards us as opposed to our competitors, it's never been easier. And the fact that I could smash out an episode of my podcast in a car parked alongside the lake in Queenstown or in my hotel room in Sydney last week or whatever, it's just the technology's there, it's cheap, it's easy to use. The magic is in your content. That's where if there's a pressure, it's no longer in the technology or the cost. It's creating good content.
Yeah. The podcast is, from your own personal branding standpoint, is the thing that you're known for. And, you're number one on iTunes for marketing podcasts, and it's unreal to see an Aussie up in the What's Hot section of iTunes globally as well, which is incredible. So just on that, what does it actually mean that you are in the What's Hot section of iTunes globally? I mean, is that a per downloads thing? Is it a number of reviews?
Well, the answer is I don't, but I thought one day about 3 years ago, I thought, stuff this, I'm going to call Apple, knowing how secretive Apple is. Anyway, I got through to Apple at French's Forest in Sydney.
Yep.
I got through the first Doberman, which was the receptionist. I don't know how I did. And then she put me through to the iTunes division.
Yep.
And I got through to someone in iTunes, and I explained that I wanted, because at the time I was like, geez, it was early days in my podcast. It was like, geez, I keep rating really well and I'm in What's Hot, and how's this happening? Finally got to then the person in iTunes put me through to, I'm guessing it's like the brand manager or the marketing manager of iTunes, who was a bit annoyed that I'd got through to them. But before she realised that she shouldn't be talking to me, she mentioned the concept of touches. The amount of time someone touches an episode link or your podcast link in the iTunes store. And I think they weight touches differently. So one touch might be someone leaving a review.
Yep.
Another touch might be someone downloading or streaming an episode just there and then. Another touch might be someone who subscribes and commits to having each episode downloaded as it's posted. And I think each touch has a different weighting within the algorithm. And that's as much as I know.
Right. That makes a fair bit of sense. Do you know how many downloads you have per month?
It's lots. No, I don't really. It's thousands and thousands.
Yep.
And, unfortunately with podcasting, it's not the accurate science yet. In my keynote, one of the things I talk about is the fact that I get downloaded in 110 countries. I found that out through Google Analytics, and I make the joke that one of those countries is Kazakhstan. And I was like, what's Borat doing listening to my show? And then literally 2 days ago, I got an email from a listener who said, you might not realise this, but you've got a listener in Madagascar. And this person, his name was Kevin, with the longest surname I've ever seen, was a listener, and he lives in Madagascar. So isn't it amazing? And then, what listeners go, there might be a plumber listening to this, and he goes, well, why would I ever want to do a podcast when my customers are within a 5 kilometre radius of where I live? And that's sort of valid, but what building a global audience does, or at least an audience beyond your business's radius, is that it forces you to create additional products or services that you can sell to people outside of your normal business radius. So for me, when I started a podcast, I was a marketing consultant in Melbourne. I did a bit of work in Sydney, never got to travel overseas. But then I started to build a global audience, and it forced me to, for example, create a forum. So I now have the Small Business Big Marketing Forum, and that's in response to people, to business owners everywhere saying, hey, can you consult to us, or how can we access some of your thinking, Tim, around marketing? And it's like, well, okay, well, I'll start a forum. And speaking's a complete, like, all of a sudden,
whole new product line.
Yeah, it is. So it's kind of interesting that. And I interviewed a tradesman in Colorado about 2 years ago who did exactly this, where he built his trade business and he had a podcast and a video marketing channel on YouTube, and he realised that he was starting to get a whole lot of listeners who were tradesmen from all around the world. So he's now got a product where he trains tradesmen in how to build a good business. So he's still a tradie. He was actually an odd jobs guy, but now he's got an online training product where he talks to tradies about how to manage staff, how to manage the books, how to market, and all that type of stuff. So, we've got to broaden our thinking.
Yeah, it's really interesting, I mean, certainly a lot of people are talking about it, and maybe it's just because of the timing as well, but the idea of build an audience and then find out what they need, as opposed to trying to sell your product and trying to sell it, trying to find customers. And it's just a bit of a, inverting sort of business thinking, really, isn't it?
Totally. It's like, any of this stuff we talk about, and what we're talking about podcasting so far, but any of these new, call them modern marketing channels. It seems a bit naff, but podcasting, video, blogging, blogging's bloody been around since the internet was around, but there's still plenty of room for growth there. Self-publishing. All these things, if you put your message out there and people gravitate towards it and go, geez, I like what that person or that business is saying on a podcast or a video, I'd like a bit more of them, then you need to be open and give people ways of letting you know what bit more would you like. Would you like me to run a live event? Would you like me to write a book? Would you like me to create a particular product that I don't have, but if there's enough demand for it, I could probably create? And this is great. You build an audience and ask them. It's like the lean startup. The guy in that book says, sharpen your offer on the stone of the market.
Yeah.
That's beautiful. I love that phrase. And it's like, let them tell you what they want.
Yeah, and so much more valuable than you guessing at it, hey?
Totally.
Mm. I mean, podcasting is the theme of this podcast, which is great. So why did you start your podcast in the first place?
Well, okay, the strategic reason, and it's sort of like in retrospect, because I needed to differentiate myself from every other marketing consultant out there. Yep. And so in hindsight, and I think I did it subconsciously, it was like, well, I listen to podcasts. I love them. No one's doing them, certainly in Australia. There's certainly no marketing people in Australia doing them. I'll do it. And that was kind of the subconscious thing. The reality is I just had an amazing opportunity handed to me, and I don't like telling the story because it kind of makes it sound as though this needs to happen to you in order to have a podcast. You absolutely don't. But my story goes, I worked for a moment in time at a charity. Charity helped young people at risk. One of the young fellows who came through that charity went on to become, he got a job in radio. And this young bloke, I would every now and then very, very informally mentor. Like, no, wasn't a formal mentoring thing, but he'd drop past my office when I worked at this charity, and we'd have a chin wag, and, he obviously appreciated it. He went on to get a job in radio. He subsequently became the producer of the Hamish and Andy show, which was at the time the biggest radio show in Australia.
Massive.
He went on to do even bigger things in radio, still does. And I was catching up for a coffee with him about 5.5 years ago, and I just happened to say, I'd love my own podcast. And he said, anytime you want to use the studio in at the radio station, feel free to, as a way of him returning the favour. So that was how I got my start in podcasting. But let me tell you, you don't need a studio. I don't know what you're doing right now, Tobes, but I'm sitting at home on my MacBook with a $230 microphone, a $5 pair of earphones, and talking to you on Skype.
Yeah, no, there's no radio studio required, that's for sure, is it?
Nah.
Not even close.
Nah.
So, Timbo, how do you sort of manage your podcasting then? You say you put them out weekly. Do you batch your interviews? Do you use a set of questions? You know, how much time goes into it?
Well, a lot of questions there. I might have 3 interviews in the can at any one time, but just the interview. The nature of the Small Business Big Marketing Show is that I share a marketing opinion up front. I have 2 sponsors who I have to do live reads for. I answer a listener question. I share some listener feedback. I run the interview, and then I summarise that interview with my top 3 learnings. So there's a number of other segments that I put around the interview, and I do those segments on a week-by-week basis in order to keep things fresh and in order to not necessarily time. I don't like doing time-sensitive stuff. Like, I don't wait to do next week's show today because I want to talk about something that's happening this weekend, because the nature of podcasting is pretty evergreen. But yeah, so I do interviews when I get the opportunity to do them, and then I put the show together pretty much on a Wednesday for a Tuesday release, and probably takes me about, I reckon all up, Tobes, it'd take me, including the interview, which goes for about 30 to 40 minutes, maybe like 3 hours a week, and that's everything. And I don't do any editing. I refuse to do anything mechanical. I don't do the editing. I don't do the show notes. I push publish.
Just the voice.
Yeah, just the voice. Any business owner who's thinking of getting into some kind of content marketing, my view is, assuming there's a bit of cash flow that you can pay an editor or you can pay someone to work your WordPress site or whatever it is, then you focus on the content, you focus on sharing your knowledge, and let others do the rest. You don't service your car, so why do it on your podcast?
Yeah. No, that certainly makes a heap of sense.
Mm.
You mentioned there, like your podcast sponsorship. You've got 2 sponsors. Who are they?
Net Registry and 99 Designs.
Awesome. And are you able to share the story of how you went about securing those?
They've been on board for over 2 years. They're just a golden sponsor, and I worked hard. I reckon I spent 6 months trying to get a sponsor. It might have been more than 2 years ago, actually. I reckon I started trying to get one. Actually, it was after show 80 when Luke left. I got a sponsor just after Luke left, which is kind of funny because it started then the show became cash flow positive. I approached businesses. Podcasting was something they weren't that au fait with. They were more into, running radio ads and all that type of stuff. I went to a conference one day. There was some exhibitors there. Net Registry stand was just brilliant. The branding was brilliant. The information on it was just all about helping small businesses get their marketing sorted online. It just played right into my editorial mission for my show.
Yeah. And
got talking to them, and good on them. They signed up and have never looked back, and they've been fantastic. And then 99 Designs, they came about because I got approached by one of their offshoot companies, a company called Swiftly, which is a micro-tasking site to get small design fixes done. And they came on about 6-7 months ago just to get their brand launched, and it worked. And their parent company, which is 99 Designs, then came and said, okay, well, Swiftly don't need you anymore. You've done the work. You've launched the brand, helped launch the brand. So they took on the sponsorships. And again, it's like if you're going to get a sponsor, and that's only one revenue channel for a podcast or other content marketing, there's other ways of making money from them. But if you are going to get a sponsor, you need sponsors that are strategically right for you and for your audience. So, during the time of looking for a sponsor, Tobe, I had a guy approach me who had some really cool bookkeeping software, online bookkeeping software. But my editorial mission, that filter that determines what I talk about on my show and what gets included, it's all about marketing tips and tricks for small service-based businesses to help them generate inquiry. That's kind of my filter. And a piece of bookkeeping software doesn't fit into that. So, I had to say no. So you want sponsors that are relevant to your audience, that are relevant to what you talk about, and that you can comfortably talk about them without a script, but just talk about them.
Yeah. So you're sort of speaking from the heart about your services and how you use them and what have you. Do you use Net Registry?
Yeah, they host my website.
Yeah. making sure that it's consistent and the values and stuff.
Yep.
So how do you go about then getting guests for your show, Timbo? If you've done 205, are you running out?
Oh, no way. As if, mate. I mean, I haven't scratched the surface. The premise of a guest on my show is a business owner that's using marketing effectively and interestingly. So how do I do it? Flying back the other day from Brisbane, I had the Virgin magazine in front of me and identified probably 4 guests just by reading articles. I've got a pile of about 50 emails from listeners suggesting or people suggesting themselves, but many of them don't fit. A lot of authors, which I'm more interested in business owners as opposed to service providers to small businesses. You just don't run out, mate. I mean, there are so many, you know. Funny story, I've been trying to get Seth Godin on my show for about a year, and he knocked me back when I first emailed him. Seth Godin's like the marketing doyen of the world, for those who don't know.
I actually saw him last week.
You did you?
In Sydney, yeah, he was brilliant.
Yeah, well, I heard he was, and I was invited to that, and I couldn't go because I had a speaking engagement. I was invited both to the Sydney and the Melbourne event, and I couldn't go to either. So I've been chasing him for a year, and he knocked me back. He said no for reasons that I've shared on my show previously. I then was invited to his events, couldn't go to that. Then here I am. I was sitting at the Park Hyatt in Sydney having dinner last Thursday night, and in he walks. And he sits at the table next to me. Now, it was amazing. I couldn't bring myself. I don't like interrupting public figures during their private time, so I actually didn't say anything, actually. But I intend to email him and let him know that.
Yep.
And hopefully he will respect that and decide to come on. So that's a guest. You know, I've probably had 5 guests during the course of my podcasting career that have said no, that have politely declined.
Yep.
He's one of them. But, you know, most people want to be interviewed, Toby, as you would know.
Mm.
You know, it plays to the ego.
Yep.
And it's an opportunity for people to either tell their story, to be heard, to sell something, build awareness. So I think given that that's the case, I think even us podcasters who don't have the biggest audiences in the world, some of us have bigger audiences than others, but relative to, say, a radio program, we're still smaller audiences. But it doesn't mean we shouldn't be selective about our guests, because I think, again, if you go back to the content, the fact that you podcast is not going to be the magic. It's what and how you podcast that's the magic, and what you say and how you say it. And the quality of your guest will determine that. And that doesn't mean having a guest of note. That doesn't mean having a celebrity. It just means having someone that is interesting and has something to say and, you know, for me, can make a difference to my listeners' lives.
Yeah. And have you found that particular questions, because I guess over 205 shows, you must have had a huge array of answers and discussions, but have you found that there have been particular questions that get great responses from guests?
I have a much greater interest in people's stories. Generally, the structure of it, you ask me, do I have a set of questions? No, I don't, but I have a structure that is a funnel, and at the top of the funnel is the opening questions, and all those questions about, tell us about your business idea. Because mine's a marketing show, it's like, tell us about your business idea. Where did it come from? What problem were you solving when you came up with that idea? Tell us about taking it to market, and sort of really the bird's eye view of the business. And once I've established the idea and what this person does, I like to then ask them to wrap some numbers around it. You know, revenue, customers, website traffic, number of staff, number of offices, whatever the most relevant scoreboard is for that discussion. I then like to say, okay, well, that's interesting. You know, I love asking people what keeps them up at night, moments when they were looking down the barrel of maybe losing everything, because many successful people have looked down that barrel.
Yeah.
And then I get into the tin tacks of marketing. So, geez, you do such and such. You tell us about how you've used Facebook to do, and whilst that's interesting, that's kind of I call it the mechanics of marketing. And my show's not a how-to show. It's a show that I want to inspire people to do great things in.
Yep.
So, yeah, but that's the kind of line of questioning. And then but then what happens along the way, someone will say something very off the cuff, very flippantly. Oh, yeah. So we were 6 months into launching the business, and my partner ran away with my wife, so I had to go and kind of keep things running. And they keep talking, and it's at that point you go, oh, hang on, sorry, do you mind if I ask? You said your partner ran away with your wife. Now, you might not want to talk about this, but if you do, can you tell us what happened and how that made you feel? I look out for those rabbit holes and go down them.
Yep. And do you find guests are typically comfortable to respond to those?
They are. Much more than you would think. Most people would think, and I gave a fairly extreme personal example then.
Of course, yeah.
But most people, they just say stuff and don't even think about how interesting that is to my listeners. So when I'm podcasting, I'm a listener. I'm just the number one listener because I've got the microphone, and my mindset is that I like to just be I have got 30 minutes with this person that I didn't think I would ever have got, not because necessarily they're famous. Sometimes they are, but because why would I be speaking to this person otherwise than the fact that I want to have them a guest on my show? So now that I've got them, what would we all love to hear from them? And let my curiosity run a bit wild. I might even go into my forum and say, hey, listen, I'm interviewing such and such. What questions have you got for them? Or go out onto Facebook. And I think the best marketing is done, and, podcast interviewing for me is a form of marketing, is done when you've got your consumer hat on. You're not your business hat. You're just another person.
Yeah, that's a really neat way to look at it. That's really good, actually. I love that.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah. Sorry, I mean, amongst all this other gold that you're sharing as well, thanks, Timbo. Yeah, that's a really, I guess, particularly for me as the interviewer, a really interesting way of looking at it too. Do you have a favourite podcast? The ones you've done, do you have sort of standout ones that you feel, and then perhaps we can link to it in the show note?
It's interesting because I'm in the process of putting together kind of a best of CD, which sounds so old school, but
Smash Hits 2014.
Smash Hits, but it's like, well, because I'm speaking, I've done 50 or more speaking gigs this year, and often they ask, and I admire you guys so much for having a book. I don't have a book. I've got a 250-page ebook, but don't have a book.
That's a book in my book.
Yeah, it is, but I just haven't sort of gone the extra step and turn it into something. It doesn't have a thud factor about it.
Just print it out, Timbo.
Yeah, correct. A4, get it bound at Officeworks. I am putting together a best of, but boy, oh boy, mate, it's tough. Ones that come to mind, I interviewed a lady, Melissa Maker from Clean My Space, about 6 weeks ago. She has a cleaning business in Toronto. She's a house cleaner, but she has started a video marketing strategy that has changed her world. She's like what's that cleaning lady in America? Doesn't matter, but she's like the go-to cleaning person in Canada. She now consults to YouTube and big brands that want to know how she does what she does. And so YouTube, so that's an amazing story. I interviewed Warwick Kappa, overseas listeners, you have no idea who this is, but it's an Aussie rules footballer from the 80s.
Icon.
He's an icon. He's a complete duffer. And I just had this burning question to know whether is he as dumb as I think he is or as smart as I think he is. And he's managed to make an incredible career even today. And he played footy in the 80s. So that was fascinating. I interviewed Siri, like the lady Karen Jacobson. She shared a stage with me at this gig I spoke at in Disneyland. She is the voice of Siri. She is the voice of TomTom Navigation, and she's built a business out of that.
Phenomenal. Right
through to a dentist that sacked all his clients and took his shingle down and got a silent number and turned his business around. I've interviewed Tom Dixon from Will It Blend fame. That was incredible. A guy who just is so passionate about his blenders that he does extreme product demonstrations. I've interviewed a gym owner who has 40 of her clients have tattooed her logo on their bodies.
The next Harley Davidson.
Yes, but that's Harley Davidson. This is just a little local gym.
Yeah.
And how has she done that? So I've interviewed a guy who's got millions and millions of dollars of free publicity through some really clever guerrilla marketing. Oh, mate, it blows my mind, Tobe. And as I even go through it, I'm reminded of, and you'll be the same as you create more content. You guys are prolific as well. You must, and we must, all of us who do create content must remind ourselves of this asset that we're creating, not just for us to further promote our businesses, but for people who just don't know it's there, you know?
Yeah. Well, I mean, Timbo, and I think we've spoken about this in the past as well, is one of the things that I love about doing the podcast is how much you learn in a half-hour chat.
Mm.
You get to ask questions. I heard someone sort of phrased it as being it's the questions that you wouldn't get to ask if you were standing at the bar with the same person. To have had this chat about podcasting with you, it's tough it's outside of an interview situation to ask all these questions, really. It's almost socially awkward.
Yeah. But the nature of this chat that you and I are having is that, well, we're here to create a piece of content in the form of a podcast, and without you setting the ground rules, we know that we're here to podcast. You're here to pick my brain about what I do in my business. So there is a fence, an invisible fence around us, and that kind of forms the structure of the discussion. And it wouldn't happen in a bar because you'd be off distracted by other things.
For sure. Absolutely. And so, Timbo, if you couldn't podcast, what would be your next best strategy then?
So if podcast was taken away. Yeah, that's a good question. Is it just like next marketing strategy? Or does it have to be like an online?
Oh, no. Yeah, anything. Yeah.
Oh, I love speaking. If you haven't figured that out. So public speaking, again, scares most of us, still scares me, but I just have a view of wanting to teach and share knowledge, and I've decided to teach marketing, and I do it via podcasting. I love just as much doing it from stage, and that's even more because you get that instant thing, like you're on stage, you're getting feedback instantly anyway, whether it's good, bad, or indifferent, and then you get off stage and there's that interaction. So, and immediately whether you've made a difference or not. So I do like the old public speaking.
Yeah, cool. No, and I guess that's a sort of a one-to-many environment too, isn't it?
Yeah.
You, as opposed to just doing hundreds of one-on-one consults, you're doing 1 to 100 in one hit, which is pretty fun too.
I'll ask you, Tobe, how many episodes in are you?
I'm just about to publish number 43.
Right. Okay, so you've got enough to answer this question. What, outside of it driving business to Blue Wire, what's one amazing thing that's happened as a result of you podcasting?
Well, the learning, really. Like, to me, I've learned so much from the people that I've interviewed. And the flip side of that has been Adam and I, we've got a few different sort of formats for our podcast. In some we interview people, in others we sort of discuss. For instance, we had a discussion on the Seth Godin event last week as a sort of a debrief and a way of reflecting and, sort of embedding the learning, I guess, from that experience, which was unreal. And I mean, even in one instance, deepening a friendship, funnily enough, a guy who was relatively, he was my neighbour, became a mate. He has a really interesting business, Stab Surfing magazine. His is a great story as well. And, to be able to ask him the questions about his business and stuff, I don't know, it's an opportunity to build a bond too, which I've found an interesting part of the process too. Yep.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can tell you, mate, I'll ask you this in 50 episodes. When you're up to near 100, you'll have some more amazing answers to that question. And they don't have to be amazing. Like for me, checking into a hotel alongside the President of the United States, that's kind of amazing. But it's not like necessarily that. It's like, when I was interviewing Melissa from Clean My Space, she was at YouTube's office in New York, just having finished sitting on a panel consulting big brands like Coca-Cola about how to create content marketing.
Nice,
and this is a lady who had a cleaning business in Canada. So, when I had this whole discussion on that episode. In fact, I'll give you the link. That's the link I'll give you if you wanted to a specific episode, because We call it the woo-woo factor. Just woo-woo stuff happens when you put yourself out there.
Yep. Yeah, it's fun, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's amazing.
Totally.
So what's next then on the marketing front for you, Timbo?
For me, a lot more speaking for the coming 12 months. And I really, really would love to do my own events. You know, if the truth be known, it's like, you know, I speak at other people's events all the time, and I need to find actually the courage. You know, if I be totally honest, it's the finding the courage to hang out my own shingle and say, come to my event and listen to me, as opposed to, you know, a whole lot of other people. And I just want to make sure that that's of massive value to people. And, you know, getting bums on seats is an honour, and it's hard, as you would know.
Yeah.
And
I mean, we've had a crack at a few ourselves, Timbo, so if we can help at all, we'd love to. Yeah.
You know, and my view is, see, I do these things. If I do a podcast is an end for me, because it's sponsorship. Like, I don't podcast to build my business, although I podcast to earn $1 and I get sponsorship, right?
Yep.
I speak not to sell product from stage, because I'm speaking on someone else's stage and I'm being paid to do it. And so for me, if I run an event, it's the end point. I'm not going to run a free event to then sell people into a $1,000 program like many do. I'm more interested in, you know, like, no, I'm having an event, and you're going to leave that event and your business is going to be better for it, as opposed to, you know, I've just fleeced you for another $5,000. And I feel a pressure from doing that, because every time you're putting something out there, it's like the end. It's not a means.
Yeah. And I mean, in the best way possible, you know, that pressure drives the quality, right?
Does. Totally, because you're focused on the content, not on the pitch at the end.
Yeah. And if it needs to be a standalone piece, then so much the better.
Yeah. So, yeah, that's probably what's next. Putting the book together, the best of CDs.
Yes. I look forward to that.
Yes, why not?
Yeah. Platinum edition, signed box set, best of Timbo Reid.
Bring it on.
Yeah, indeed. Mate, here was a question that I was asked when I was being interviewed on a podcast.
I'm going to guess what it is.
Well, you guess it.
Because I reckon I've done it before.
What's that?
Is there something I haven't asked you that I should have?
Yes, that's it. Oh, geez, everyone's doing it.
No, I don't know. I'm not sure it's a great question. I've dabbled with that question, and it theoretically makes sense, but it puts your guest on the spot. And sometimes putting a guest on the spot can be fun, but at the end of an interview, I'm giving you some interview coaching. No, and by the way, I've never done any interview courses, but I just think that, it's a pressure on them, and it kind of says, I think, to the listener, and I could be wrong here, that, oh shit, he's out of questions, but he doesn't want to quite finish yet, so he's going to turn it over to the guest to see if they can continue. I don't know.
Oh, that's okay. No, I must admit, when it was asked of me, I really grappled with it. I struggled.
Yeah.
So maybe I should have just learnt from my own lesson, which is...
Well, I think what it says to us as the interviewer is... It's maybe the question that we should ask when planning the interview. And I do go through this my thought process, particularly with people who get interviewed all the time. And most of my guests don't get interviewed all the time, but every now and then you do come across, like, if I do get Seth Godin on the show, he would have been asked the same questions over and over and over again. So my challenge to make the interview interesting for listeners and for me and for him, most importantly, is, what hasn't he been asked that would be really interesting to find the answer to? And it's not about asking him. It's about trying to figure it out before you get him.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, interesting.
That's a really good piece of advice for any podcasts people out there, or those aspiring. Don't ask that question.
No, and like... My number one thing, and I haven't done any interview courses, journalism courses, nothing like that. I'm just curious. And that drives my questioning.
Well, Timbo, that's a pretty nice way to close, really. Just
cool.
Be curious as a final piece of advice for the listeners. So the last thing is just, how can people connect with you?
I'll give them two ways. If they want to join my forum, and I go in there every day answering questions of you've got to be a motivated business owner, though. That's the only premise that you can qualify. But head over to smallbusinessbigmarketing.com and click on the forum button, and it takes about a minute to get inside there. Or if you want me to speak, head over to timreid.com.au. That's my speaker's site. That's it.
Excellent. Well, I'll make sure those links are in the show notes. But
thanks, Tobe.
Thanks very much for joining me, mate, on a Friday afternoon. And
That's it.
Hopefully you've finished your beer by now.
I don't drink while I'm podcasting, Toby. Goodness me.
Only when you're being interviewed.
Goodness me. I don't know, you Sydney-type people or Brisbane, wherever you are.
Yeah.
You're all show.
Oh, well, mate, have a great weekend, and thanks so much for joining me. Really appreciate it, Timbo.
Thanks, Tobe. Bye, everyone.
So that wraps up the interview with Tim Reid. Thanks so much for joining us today. It's so good to be able to pick a guy like Tim's brains about everything podcasting. He has done so much, and really appreciate the fact that he's prepared to share so much detail with us all too. As always, the show is brought to you by Web Marketing That Works, the book, and specifically the bonus 33 free templates that go with it. If you're keen to download those, jump on over to www.bluewiremedia.com.au/book. Our intent is always to deliver actionable advice, so please send through your feedback or questions via email or Twitter. My email address, toby.jenkins@bluewiremedia.com.au, or I am at Toby_Jenkins. And I'd love to hear if you have any guest suggestions as well, or people you'd like us to try to get on the show. Thanks so much, and if you enjoyed the show, please leave an honest review on iTunes, and look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks.